Welcome to the show. You're listening to Green Hell, a Vietnam War podcast. Join me as I explore the history of the Vietnam War, remember the sacrifices and experiences of those who were there, and preserve those lessons learned and paid for through blood and unimaginable human suffering. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Stephen Comstock. As of this recording, it is February 24th, 2025, and I'm excited for today's episode. Most likely it's going to be one of 2 or 3, maybe more episodes, depending on how long it takes. I'm going to try to break these down into consumable chunks, not mega long episodes where it's just too much, but we'll see. Anyway, today we're going to be diving into the beating heart of communist ideology, starting with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, then fast forwarding to Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, and all the other revolutionaries who promised utopia and delivered hell. These guys didn't just write books, they lit fuses that sparked revolutions, toppled empires, and changed the course of history. Why is it important? Well, since the war in Vietnam, and the entire Cold War for that matter, was rooted in containing the spread of this ideology, it's important to really understand it and know the history. History is context, and context is what allows you to have informed opinions and not just be adult regurgitating propaganda. Too often I've noticed, at least when it comes to Vietnam War documentaries, they leave out some of the finer points about communist ideology / history that I think is pretty important. So plop yourself on the shitter, like I know you do when you're listening to my show, and let's unpack this wild, ambitious, not entirely wrong cluster known as communism. Okay, so it's 1848. Europe's a powder keg. Kings are shaking. Workers are striking. And in London, 2 bearded intellectuals, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, are scribbling away at a pamphlet that'll circulate Parisian cafes, factory break rooms, university DEI offices, Soho bookstores, Portland tattoo parlors, Viet Minh cadre camps, etc., and will become a battle cry for millions, nay, billions to this very day. It's the manifesto of the Communist Party. Their first premise: human history is entirely a tale of class struggle. The haves versus the have-nots, freemen and slaves, lords and serfs, bosses and workers. By 1848, Marx and Engels saw capitalism splitting society into the bourgeoisie, factory-owning fat cats, remnants of the nobility class, and the proletariat, the sweaty, underpaid masses making everything run, the modern serfs. And here are some of the working conditions that the proletariat workers in the 19th century industrial cities had to live through. And this is important because it kind of explains the animosity that is expressed by communism. So they worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, 6 or 7 days a week, dawn to almost midnight, textile mills, coal mines, steelworks, you name it, they did it. Workers stumbled home half dead, slept a few hours, dragged ass back day after day. Kids as young as 6 clocked in 10 to 14-hour workdays. Machines were death traps. You had unguarded belts, spinning blades, no emergency shutoffs, no safety features. Cotton mills, kids crawled under looms to fix threads. Crushed skulls and severed limbs were routine. Coal mines? Workers died from cave-ins, explosions, and black lung from dust inhalation. A British report from 1842 pegged miner life expectancy at 35. Factory air was thick with soot, fibers, metal dust. As a result, tuberculosis and pneumonia were a common face of the Grim Reaper back then. Child labor was the norm. It was cheaper than adults and provided small hands for tight spots. Orphans or poor kids were apprenticed to mill owners. That's a euphemism for pressed into slavery. They'd work 12 hours, they'd get beat for slowing down, they slept in filthy dorms, and they were maimed by machines, died on the job, many drowned in mining floods. For all their troubles, they got paid barely enough for bread in a slum cot. For example, a textile worker might pull 2 to 3 shillings a week. That's about $10 to $15 today. And rent took about half that. Kids earned pennies, and bosses docked pay for machine jams, whether it was your fault or not. Ingalls noted Manchester workers in 1840s lived shorter than peasants due to malnutrition and exhaustion. The factories were dark, hot, damp. Think sweatbox with no vents. There were no toilets. There were just buckets or alleys. Everyone worked back then. Dad, mom, kids, they all punched the clock. Men hauled coal or forged steel. Women spun cotton or sewed piecework at home, getting pennies per dozens of shirts they made. A family of 5 might scrape together 10 shillings a week and still teeter on starvation. It wasn't uncommon for families to live 6 to a room, maybe more. They slept on straw, and children would wail from hunger as their parents limped back day after day to the factory. There was no time for family bonding. At best, you got a nap together before your next grueling shift. Families working all day long would still have no savings, and if something unexpected happened and you couldn't make rent, you were out on your ass. Factory workers typically lived in slums near factories. These neighborhoods were cramped and damp, located in smoggy, loud hellholes that were infested with rats, lice, scabies, and prone to disease outbreaks such as typhus and cholera that would kill tens of thousands at a time. There was no insurance or disability pay. If you lost an arm or hand in a machine, fired on the spot. You're replaceable. There's plenty of other desperate workers everywhere in these hellscapes, and they'll just find somebody else to take your spot. One lady lost her hand and couldn't work. Her 6-year-old became the primary earner. He was crushed in a machine a year later, and this kind of thing happened all the time. Horrible, unimaginable conditions for us privileged people in 2025 living in the United States or developed countries. Factory safety acts existed on the books, but they were seldom enforced. A bribe to the inspector would keep factories operating regardless of conditions. One crazy story that happened in 1866 at the Oaks Colliery, an explosion suffocated or incinerated 383 workers, including 91 kids. The bosses shrugged, the widows got nothing, the slums got larger. I'll leave it to your power of imagination to surmise what a widow might do to survive without resources and with mouths to feed. And so this was the grind in the 19th century. Workers and kids chewed up, families hanging by a thread, one slip, you're screwed. Marx and Engels saw it, screamed exploitation, and frankly, they weren't wrong. Back then, and certainly in some places today, capitalism ran on the blood, sweat, tears, and broken bodies of men, women, and children alike. And there just ain't no denying it. It was, and still is in some places, pure hell. Unfortunately, as we shall soon see, the solution offered by communism and the vision of utopia hardly succeeds. And spoiler, the workers' utopia of China and Vietnam in the year 2025 are notorious for sweatshops and terrible working conditions for laborers that slave away to produce the stuff we live on in the civilized, developed Western world, like your iPhone, those fresh Nikes, and the wood in your IKEA table. So anyway, 1844. Discontent erupts across Europe. Paris, Berlin, Vienna. Workers and peasants are storming barricades and demanding rights. Marx and Engels, they think, this is it. The proletariat, they're waking up. But nope, those revolts fizzle. The Communist Manifesto lives on. It gets translated into a dozen languages by 1850, and it spreads like wildfire. In the Communist Manifesto, and later in the volume Das Kapital, which Marx and Engels drop in 1867, they posit that capitalism is unmatched at building stuff, but it overproduces. It crashes markets. It starves workers. It simply is unsustainable. And I'm about to read the following contradictions that they see inherent in capitalism that they posit will inevitably lead to capitalism's downfall. 1. Workers collaborate in factories, mines, or other enterprises, but the profits and control of those resources are concentrated in the hands of a very few private owners. This mismatch, they argued, creates inefficiency and discontent as the majority who produce wealth see little of its benefits. In the Communist Manifesto, Chapter 1, it is written, quote, "The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society." In other words, the means of production are creating sharper class divides amongst the owners of the means of production and those who work the means of production, the instruments, the machines of industrialized factories and industries. Okay. 2, capitalists, driven by profit, push to produce more and more goods to outcompete each other. But because workers' wages are kept low to maximize profits, the working class lacks the purchasing power to buy all those goods. This leads to periodic crises, booms followed by busts, where unsold products pile up, businesses fail, and unemployment spikes. In Das Kapital, Volume 1, Chapter 25, it is written, quote, "The ultimate reason for all real crises always remains the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses, as opposed to the drive of capitalist production to develop the productive forces as if only the absolute consuming power of society constituted their limit," end quote. So what does that mean? It means all this production is creating a ton of goods and services, but there's not enough capital being generated to buy the goods and services. These inefficiencies cause industries to overproduce, fire workers, create unemployment. In the Communist Manifesto, Chapter 1, it's a little more dramatic, a little more poetic, but they get the point across, I think. Quote, "A society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has called up by his spells," end quote. All right. So the third thing that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels point to that's going to be the downfall of capitalism is that competition forces capitalists to innovate and cut costs, often by replacing workers with machines or squeezing labor harder. Over time, this shrinks the working class's share of wealth while enriching a shrinking elite. The growing inequality fuels resentment and class antagonism, setting the stage for revolt. In the Communist Manifesto, Chapter 1, it is written, quote, "The modern laborer, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth," end quote. All right, what's pauperism? Pauperism is welfare. You become a welfare queen. So in other words, the system of capitalism is creating more and more people that are forced onto welfare, and this is unsustainable. In Das Kapital, Volume 1, Chapter 25, it's written, quote, "The extraordinary productiveness of modern industry, brought about by the upsurge of machinery and the subdivision of labor, allows, with the prolongation of the workday, not only an increased supply of surplus value, but also the replacement of laborers, when unemployed, by the constant generation of a relative surplus population or industrial reserve army." All right, so again, this capitalist system that they were seeing back then would often lead to many people being destitute despite the production that these machines were allowing for, right? So even with all the production increases that were created by the machines, you still had a growing army of destitute, out of work, unemployed, poor people that were just sitting around getting bitter at the conditions that they were forced into, according to Marx and Engels, that is. All right. 4. As capitalism expands, it unites workers across regions and industries, giving them the tools, like unions or political movements, to challenge the system. Marx and Engels predicted this would culminate in a revolution where the working class seizes the means of production, abolishing private property and capitalism itself. In Chapter 1 of the Communist Manifesto, it is written, quote, "The development of modern industry cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie, therefore, produces, above all, are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable." Likewise, in Das Kapital, Volume 1, Chapter 10, it is written, quote, "In the struggle, this mass becomes united and constitutes itself as a class for itself. The interests it defends become class interests, but the struggle of class against class is a political struggle." End quote. All right, to further drill down on the nature of this class struggle, I'm going to quote some more passages from the Communist Manifesto. Quote, "The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state." End quote. All right, so this is where up to this point, right? Like up to this point, it's kind of like, okay, I get what you're putting down, Marx and Engels. Like, yeah, capitalism back then especially, and even still today, has its issues, and there is always a certain level of exploitation, and there are some inherent contradictions that I can understand what you're saying. I don't necessarily disagree, right? Okay. But this phrase, "wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state," that's where it gets a little fishy for me personally. Okay. They refer to this literally as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Those are their words. The dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay. The revolution is described as being bloody and inevitable. The manifesto's section 4 concludes that it will be, quote, "the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions." Okay. Once in charge, quote, "the proletariat is organized as the ruling class," end quote. This is only temporary, of course. The centralized proletariat rulership must organize in order to crush the opposition, then it will naturally disband. Naturally. This theorized communist government must immediately abolish the private ownership of the means of production, levy a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, abolish all inheritance rights, confiscate the property of rebels and of those who flee, centralize the banks and credit lenders into the hands of the state, centralize the means of communication and transportation. The industrial and agricultural base must be nationalized. Equal liability of all to work, meaning everybody works, especially at farming, because you got to feed the people, right? The gradual abolition of all the distinctions between urban and rural populations. And finally, free education for all children and abolition of exploitative child labor. All right, so that last one I can for sure get down with. But some of those other ones, it's teetering on, well, is it teetering? It's blatantly authoritarianism, right? It is. Like, that's what it is. Okay. Now, here's the problem. Marx and Engels never really specify how the stateless, classless society will come about after the proletariat seized the means of production. In fact, Marx and Engels hated utopian recipes. Marx mocked it as, quote, writing recipes for the cook shops of the future. They figured revolutions aren't scripted and it would sort itself out. They did offer, however, some vague and theoretical visions of what it would be like, kind of. The Communist Manifesto says, quote, when class distinctions have disappeared, the public power will lose its political character, end quote. In Das Kapital, it says, quote, the bourgeoisie state is replaced by a free association of producers, end quote. In Friedrich Engels' Anti-Düring, it says, quote, "The state is not abolished, it withers away once class rule ends and production is socialized," end quote. All right, so Marx and Engels, they made clear their diagnosis of the problem and presented a clear vision of a cured society, right? People manage resources together, no top-down orders, merely a collective managing of logistics and sharing of resources. But they never outlined a specific plan or a way forward. They kind of just were like, "Hey, we'll let people figure it out. You can't write a recipe for this. You just got to let them figure it out." Sadly enough, in the end, neither Marx nor Engels lived to see their vision of the global communist revolution, the dissolution of class, or of state. Marx died on March 14th, 1883 in London at the age of 64. Engels died on August 5th, 1895, also in London at the age of 74. All right, now fast forward to 1917, enter stage left Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the infamous Russian who didn't just parrot Marx and Engels, but took their ideas, strapped them with dynamite, and tailored them for a world of empires, peasants, and industrialized warfare. Russia in his day was a backwater shit show. By the late 19th century, Russia still operated under a semi-feudal system, dominated by the autocratic rule of the Tsar and a landed aristocrat class. The majority of the population, around 80%, were peasants, many of whom were tied to the land through the remnants of serfdom abolished in 1861. However, the emancipation of the serfs was incomplete, and it left the peasants burdened with heavy redemption payments, land scarcity, and poor agricultural practices. This created widespread rural poverty and discontent. Compared to Western Europe, i.e., Britain, Germany, and France, Russia was significantly less industrialized. Industrialization had begun under Tsar Nicholas II's father, Alexander III, and continued under Nicholas, but it was driven by state-led initiatives and foreign investments, especially from France. However, by 1900, Russia's industrial base remained small and was concentrated in urban centers like St. Petersburg and Moscow, and was heavily reliant on foreign capital and expertise. The so-called working class, right, the proletariat, the people who worked in factories and who worked in the mills and who worked in the mines and stuff, it was small but growing. It numbered around 2 to 3 million people in 1914, but it just lacked the scale and organization that was being seen by the proletariats of Western Europe. At this point, Russia's economy was still primarily agrarian, and there were a lot of famines. The state focused a lot on military spending and maintaining the autocracy, which drained resources, left little for social reforms and infrastructure development, and left a lot of peasants very poor, very hungry, and very discontent. Now, the Tsar, Nicholas II, he clung to the autocratic traditions of the Romanov dynasty, believing in his divine right. He resisted political reforms, maintaining absolute power through the Tsarist bureaucracy. Now, there was a revolution in 1905. It was sparked by the defeat that occurred for the Russians at the hands of the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War. It basically ended when troops fired on peaceful protesters in St. Petersburg. It created a lot of distress, and it basically forced Nicholas II to issue a manifesto promising a constitutional democracy. A constitutional monarchy, not a democracy, a monarchy, but there would also be a parliament. However, he worked to undermine the parliament's power. He dissolved it multiple times. He ruled by decree still, and his general lack of accepting the fact that he wasn't as powerful as he wanted to be led to some political unrest, as you may well imagine. At this time, peasant unrest, worker strikes, and nationalist movements among non-Russian ethnic groups, that's the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Finnish, that was widespread. The 1905 revolution revealed the fragility of the Tsarist rule, but Nicholas's subsequent repression and half-hearted reforms failed to address root causes like land inequality, worker exploitation, and political exclusion. So then you've got a guy like Lenin. Lenin was active in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party and later split off to form his Bolshevik faction in 1903. Lenin saw Russia's backwardness as both a challenge and an opportunity. He argued that Russia's proletariat, that's the workers, right? The ones that work in the factories and the mines and the mills, okay? Though they were a small group, they could lead a revolution with the support of peasants, bypassing the need for a fully developed capitalist stage as Marx had envisioned for Western Europe. He believed the Tsarist autocracy and feudal remnants made Russia ripe for a socialist revolution, even if it required a vanguard party to guide the working class. All right, this is where it gets super wild, okay? Whenever you've got a guy who says the vanguard party, that is the special group of people that are there and that can do it, they're the only ones who can do it, right? They're going to guide the working class into this glorious communist uprising and eventual utopia. All right, but before we get to all that, let's talk more about Lenin. Lenin, he was born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov in 1870 to a middle-class family. His father was a teacher. His mother came from minor land-owning gentry. So he was loosely connected to the upper middle class, and because of his class status, he was afforded the very education that would fuel his radicalism and his revolutionary ideas. This would also, that is, his intellect, his revolutionary ideas, and his radicalism would lead to the deaths of millions of middle-class and educated intellectuals, people who'd been born and raised just like he was. He's a walking contradiction himself, despite all his railing against the contradictions of capitalism. So his brother was executed in 1887 for plotting against the Tsar. And this sad and tragic and traumatic event radicalized Lenin and pushed him into the revolutionary circles. By 1890, he spread socialist ideology, organized workers, and organized intellectuals against the status quo political state that he was living in, right? In 1895, he was arrested for distributing communist propaganda and organizing strikes. He was sentenced to Siberia, but he served his term in relative comfort, surprisingly. He was allowed to hunt, he was allowed to fish, he was allowed to write. His fiancée even joined him there after her own arrest, and the two were married in the Siberian Gulag in 1898. Now, these conditions of the Gulag, right, these were a far cry from the ones he would later implement on his own political prisoners. In 1900, Lenin left Russia in self-imposed exile. He bounced around Munich, London, Paris, where he continued to spread propaganda, organize workers and intellectuals, and further develop his own strain of communist theory. And I'm about to read his main points, which are built on Marx and Engels, but there are some differences. All right, 1. Capitalism, according to Lenin, had evolved into imperialism. Rich countries and banks didn't just screw their own workers, they pillaged weaker nations, entire populations, for resources and markets. In his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, published in 1916, Lenin writes, quote, "Imperialism is capitalism at that stage of development where the export of capital has become typical, where the division of the world among the international trusts has begun." End quote. So, where Marxism saw capitalism crashing from inherent contradictions that would lead to a, quote, reserve industrial army, right, of disgruntled workers who were displaced by machines and ready to revolt, Lenin adds that the imperialism of his time, the early 1900s, stalls that collapse because they're bleeding colonies dry, which is delaying the inevitable collapse of capitalism under capitalism's own weight. He writes, quote, "The export of capital influences and accelerates the development of capitalism in those countries to which it is exported." So the rubber from Vietnam was being used to increase the capital of France, for example, right? Cue the World War I whistle and the machine guns, right? 1914 through 1918, it's World War I. I've talked about it briefly. It's a little different according to Lenin than how I might convey it. So I'll go ahead and expound on what Lenin saw. Lenin saw World War I as a horrific, horrible event that sent millions to be slaughtered by machine guns, artillery, chlorine gas, hand-to-hand combat, all at the behest of the diabolical imperial powers. Germany, France, Britain, all of them. And it was ultimately all about control, or to keep control of their colonies. That's India, Africa, Indochina, etc., right? For the sake of keeping the failing capitalist system afloat. They needed their colonies. They couldn't have their colonies. They couldn't keep their systems afloat. All right, that's Lenin's idea, at least. 12 million colonial troops fought for these exploitative empires that were powered by capitalism, mainly to the benefit of the class enemy, right? The rulers of these countries, the industrial captains of these countries, the bourgeoisie. Lenin believed that this global unrest, this unimaginable slaughter, and the imperial manipulation would be the opening that communists needed to incite the global conflagration of workers to rise up and overthrow the class enemies running the capitalist imperial system. But Lenin had a caveat there, and that was that the workers aren't going to rise up on their own. They're too beat, they're too uneducated, they're too clueless. You need a tight, ruthless squad of revolutionaries, the vanguard, to lead the charge. In Lenin's book, What is to be Done, published in 1902, he says, quote, "We must train people who will devote to the revolution not only their spare evenings, but the whole of their lives," end quote. Further, he says, quote, "The history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, i.e., the conviction that it is necessary to combine in unions, fight the employers, and strive to compel the government to pass necessary labor legislation," end quote. And what he's saying there is that the workers don't have it in them to overthrow. They don't have it in them to seize the means of production. They don't have it in them to be dirty, to do the dirty work that's required to completely destroy capitalism and replace it with the classless utopia of communism. Okay? So, as we're going to see, this is where communism starts to take a turn for the worse. It started off as being, some valid critiques. There's something wrong with the capitalist system. There's no doubt about that. But this is where it gets wacky. Lenin subscribed to the belief that the state was a rich man's club, and you had to break the club, and you had to crush it, and you had to build a worker state that could wield the government and crush all the class enemies until they were gone. And then at that point, it would fade and there would be no class distinctions and everything would start to be a utopia. In Lenin's book, The State and Revolution, published in 1917, he writes, quote, "The dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e., the organization of the vanguard of the oppressed as the ruling class for the purpose of suppressing the oppressor, cannot result merely in an expansion of democracy. Simultaneously, with an immense expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not democracy for the rich, the dictatorship of the proletariat imposes a series of restrictions on the freedom of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitalists," end quote. He also writes, quote, "The proletariat needs state power, the centralized organization of force, the the organization of violence, both to crush the resistance of the exploiters and to lead the great mass of the population, the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie, and the semi-proletarians, into the work of organizing socialist economy, end quote. Furthermore, he writes, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot be a gradual or peaceful transition. It is an absolutely essential transition from capitalism to communism, and it is a transition that cannot but be marked by the fierce resistance of the bourgeoisie, the resistance of the old ruling class, end quote. All right, so there you have it. Lenin makes it clear, okay? The dictatorship of the proletariat, led by the vanguard, cannot just argue for better workers' rights. They can't just argue for reform, and they can't just transition over time into a classless society. It has to be done through force. It has to be done through violent and immediate, overwhelming force. Okay, so this leads us to the question of who exactly constitutes the army. Now, I basically already said it, and that's the workers, right? But as we've said, the workers of Russia were limited in number. Russia at that time was mostly an agrarian society that had 80% peasants who tilled the land and managed the crops, right? Well, Lenin argues that, quote, the peasantry constitutes the main army of the national revolution. The proletariat must not only lead this army, but also strengthen it by giving it the land, which is the basis of its existence and struggle, end quote. So here you have it, right? Remember how Ho Chi Minh in the DRV and also Mao Zedong and the CCP in China used land reform as the major hook to get their rural peasants on board with the communist movement? Well, that ideology, that idea starts with Lenin. He says that you need the peasants and you got to give them the land. And if you give them the land, that will motivate them to get on board with the communist revolution. He further elaborates that, quote, the agrarian program of the proletariat must consist in the immediate and complete confiscation of all landed estates in favor of the peasantry. This will lay the foundation for socialism in the countryside, end quote. And if you're curious, that comes from his April theses, published April 1917. That's where he outlines a lot of his ideas on how the revolution is going to work in Russia specifically. Lenin further argues that the key to launching the global revolution is that you start it in a place like Russia, a place that's ripe for social unrest and revolution, and that once it kicks off there, it'll spread like wildfire, and the whole world will see a rising up of the workers to overthrow the bourgeoisie. The second bullet point of Lenin's April theses, published in April 1917, as I've said, is, quote, the imperialist war has created revolutionary situations in all countries, but Russia, with its autocracy and its peasant masses, stands out as the country where these conditions are most ripe for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. All right, next topic here. This is where Lenin starts to really outline how the transition from the current conditions to the communist utopia are going to take place, okay? Lenin argues that socialism is the lower stage. It's the stage where the state controls production, it fights enemies, and that communism is the higher stage. That's years off. That's after the dust settles. That's after you've consolidated hands into the dictatorship of the workers. And once that has occurred, then communism will become the natural byproduct of this process, okay? Again, he doesn't really ever outline exactly how he sees that transition occurring. And as we see in all of communist history up to the present day, it never transitions into the utopia because it never transitions out of the, quote, dictatorship of the workers or the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? It doesn't happen. It never has. It always stays in into the hands of the centralized Communist Party, and the party members, the inner party, they are the ones that call the shots, and they're the ones who run everything. In his book, The State and Revolution, Chapter 5, he writes, quote, "The state will wither away as a natural result when there are no longer any classes in society to be held in subjugation. The dictatorship of the proletariat is merely a plank in the bridge between capitalism and socialism, and then between socialism and communism, when the state will die out." End quote. And I'll read it again for good measure. Quote, "The state will wither away as a natural result when there are no longer any classes in society to be held in subjection. The dictatorship of the proletariat is merely a plank in the bridge between capitalism and socialism, and then between socialism and communism, when the state will die out." End quote. All right? That's all I'm going to say on that. That's from the horse's mouth. Okay, so as I've mentioned, but now I'm going to further reiterate, Lenin really emphasizes the fact that communism's got to spread worldwide or the capitalists are going to crush it. If you don't have the momentum of global uprisings, you're going to get crushed by the network of colonial, imperial, capitalist control, okay? Lenin writes, quote, "The socialist revolution is not a single act, not even a single war on a national scale, but a period of political and economic upheavals, of class struggles on a world scale, embracing a whole epoch of years, perhaps even decades," end quote. He further writes, quote, "The imperialist war has created revolutionary situations in all countries. The proletariat must seize power in every country, or the bourgeoisie, using its international connections, will restore its rule and crush the socialist revolution in Russia and elsewhere," end quote. All right, so finally, and to conclude on Lenin's ideas, Lenin really emphasizes the fact that violence is necessary. There's not going to be a peaceful transition. There's not going to be a gradual transition. The vanguard is going to lead the workers, and it's going to be brutal and bloody, but it's the only way that this is going to happen. Okay, that's Lenin's position. He says, in his June 1918 decree on the nationalization of industry, quote, "The proletariat must use revolutionary violence to expropriate the bourgeoisie, taking possession of the factories, mines, and railroads, and placing them under the control of the workers' state. This is the path to socialism, and it cannot be avoided in a class society," end quote. Okay, so I know that was a lot. I gave it to you raw, and I'm glad, because you know what? Listen, I quoted to you from the horse's mouth the key ideas of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, okay? I didn't make up those words. Those are their ideas. And in the next episode, we're going to see how Lenin takes that theory and enacts it in the Russian Revolution, which paves the way for all subsequent communist revolutions. And here's a spoiler alert. The history of all communist revolutions is bloody and leads to millions and millions of deaths. But I look forward to outlining all of that for you in the next episode, maybe the episode after that as well. We'll see. But for now, I leave you to digest the finer points of communism. And if you're curious to learn more about the Russian Revolution, which we're going to talk about next episode, but I have a podcast recommendation that is by a gentleman named Bill Whittle, and the series is called Empire of Terror. It covers the start all the way through Stalin, and there's also one by Bill Whittle called The Cold War, What We Saw. I've listened to both. They're extremely good, extremely high production quality, very entertaining, highly recommended. All right, Bill Whittle, look him up. And with that, I'm wrapping it up. Thanks, everybody. Take it easy.